The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community Bank hummed overhead as David Matthews shifted uncomfortably in the vinyl chair, his calloused hands gripping a manila folder thick with medical bills. At 35, the single father's weathered face told stories of sleepless nights and double shifts, while the special treatment unit access card hanging from his neck, light as a feather yet heavy as a boulder, seemed to weigh him down with every breath. Behind him in line stood a woman in a simple grey coat, her designer shoes the only hint that she didn't belong in this Tuesday afternoon crowd of loan applicants and overdraft disputes. She watched David's shoulders tense as the loan officer's voice carried across the marble floor, professional but firm. The woman's fingers traced the edge of an old art portfolio she'd been carrying for 17 years, waiting for this exact moment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews, but without sufficient collateral, we simply cannot approve your application." David's jaw worked silently as he stared at the rejection papers sliding across the polished desk. The numbers blurred together like watercolors in rain. $47,000 for Emma's surgery, insurance covering barely half. He'd known this moment might come, had rehearsed it in his mind during those 3 a.m. drives home from his second job at the warehouse. Still, hearing it out loud felt like swallowing broken glass. "Perhaps you could find a co-signer," the loan officer suggested, her voice carrying that practiced sympathy banks train their employees to perfect. "Someone with established credit history." She glanced at his application again, and David caught the slight shake of her head. Construction worker, recently divorced, single father. He knew how the story read on paper. The access card around his neck caught the afternoon light streaming through the bank's tall windows. Emma had decorated it with tiny star stickers during her last chemotherapy session, transforming the sterile white plastic into something that looked almost hopeful. The pediatric oncology team at St. Mary's had been nothing but kind, but kindness didn't cover experimental treatments that insurance companies labeled as investigational. David folded the rejection letter with the same careful precision his father had taught him for handling disappointment. Quietly, without drama, without letting the world see you break. Robert Matthews had been a master at that particular skill, weathering 30 years of teaching high school art on a salary that barely covered the basics. His father would have found a way through this somehow, would have painted something beautiful out of the mess. But Robert had been gone for 5 years now, taking with him any chance of a co-signer or family safety net. "Thank you for your time," David said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He stood slowly, feeling every one of his 35 years in his bones. The woman behind him shifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of expensive leather beneath her modest coat. Probably here for a business loan, he thought. The kind of person banks actually said yes to. As he gathered his papers, David's mind drifted to this morning's breakfast. Emma had tried to hide her pain when reaching for the orange juice, that brave little smile she'd perfected over the past 6 months. She'd asked if they could go to the art museum this weekend, the way Grandpa Robert used to take her before he died. The irony wasn't lost on him. His father had spent decades nurturing creativity in others, while David struggled just to keep the lights on. The rejection felt heavier than the stack of medical bills in his folder. He'd worked 16-hour days for the past 3 months, saving every penny, selling everything that wasn't nailed down. The old Honda in the parking lot was next, though it wouldn't bring much. Nothing he owned would make a dent in $47,000. Behind him, the woman in the grey coat watched him pause at the bank's entrance. Something in his posture, the way he straightened his shoulders before facing the world, reminded her of another man who'd carried invisible burdens with quiet dignity. Her fingers tightened around the art portfolio, and she made a decision that had been 17 years in the making. "Excuse me," she called softly. David turned, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "I couldn't help but overhear," I might be able to help." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. David's first instinct was to politely decline. Charity had never sat well with the Matthews family. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Not pity exactly. Something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. "I don't think you understand," David said carefully. "It's a significant amount of money." He gestured toward the loan officer's desk, where his rejection letter still lay like a small monument to failure. The woman smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face. "Actually, I think I understand more than you might imagine. My name is Sophia Smith, and I have a proposition for you." She glanced around the busy bank lobby, then back to David. "But not here. Would you be willing to have coffee? There's something I need to tell you about your father." David felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "My father. I'm sorry, but I think you have me confused with someone else. My father passed away 5 years ago, and I'm pretty sure he never mentioned knowing anyone named Sophia Smith." "Robert Matthews," she said quietly. "Art teacher at Jefferson High School. Drove a blue Toyota Corolla that he kept running with prayer and duct tape. Had a coffee mug with paint stains that he refused to let anyone wash because he said the stains were part of the design." The air left David's lungs in a rush. Those details weren't in any obituary or public record. This woman had known his father, really known him. But how? And why was she here now? In this bank? At this exact moment when his world was falling apart? Sophia watched the questions chase each other across his face and felt her heart break a little. He had Robert's eyes, the same thoughtful gaze that had seen potential in a scared, angry teenager when no one else bothered to look. She'd spent 17 years searching for this moment, hiring private investigators, following dead-end leads, always one step behind. Now here he was, Robert's son, facing the same kind of impossible choice she'd once faced. "Coffee," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to pick up my daughter from school in 2 hours." "Of course," Sophia replied. "There's a small cafe 2 blocks from here. Quiet place where we can talk properly." She paused, studying his face one more time. "Your father would be proud of you, David. Prouder than you know." As they walked toward the bank's exit, neither noticed the loan officer watching from her desk, her expression shifting from professional indifference to genuine curiosity. Something significant was happening here, something that went far deeper than a simple loan application. The woman who'd intervened carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, yet there was something almost reverent in the way she looked at the man with the access card around his neck. Outside, the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. David pulled his jacket tighter, suddenly aware that his entire life might be about to change directions. Behind them, Riverside Community Bank continued its steady hum of transactions and rejections, unaware that it had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. The coffee shop Sophia led him to was the kind of place his father would have loved. Mismatched chairs, local artwork on the walls, and the comfortable chaos of a business run by people who cared more about community than profit. She ordered 2 coffees without asking his preference, somehow knowing he'd want it black with 1 sugar. The small detail unsettled him more than her knowledge of his father's coffee mug. They found a corner table, and Sophia carefully placed her art portfolio on the chair beside her. The leather was worn smooth by years of handling, and David caught glimpses of sketch paper through the slightly open zipper. She noticed his gaze and smiled sadly. "Your father gave me this portfolio," she said, running her fingers along its edge. "Bought it with his own money when I couldn't afford supplies. I was 16, angry at the world, convinced that talent was something rich kids were born with, and people like me could only admire from a distance. David's coffee grew cold as she spoke. The story she told was impossible and completely believable at the same time. His father, taking a personal interest in a student whose raw talent was matched only by her circumstances. Late-night tutoring sessions, art supply purchases that Robert had hidden from David's mother by claiming they were school-provided, letters of recommendation that helped secure a scholarship to art school. "He never mentioned you," David said, not unkindly. "Dad talked about a lot of his students over the years, but never a Sophia Smith. I wasn't Sophia Smith then," she replied. "I was Sophie Park, and I lived in a trailer with my mother on the wrong side of Jefferson Street. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and slept during the day. I was basically raising myself and not doing a very good job of it." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. David remembered those years, remembered his father coming home exhausted from extra tutoring sessions he'd claimed were mandatory, remembered the arguments between his parents about money, about Robert's tendency to give more than they could afford to his students. At the time, David had resented it, had wished his father would focus more on his own family's struggles. "You changed your name," David said. "David. When I got to art school, yes. Fresh start, new identity. I wanted to leave Sophie Park and her problems behind." Sophia's smile turned rueful. "Young and stupid, thinking I could outrun gratitude. Your father taught me everything about art, about seeing beauty in unexpected places, about believing in myself. But I never learned his most important lesson. Which was that running away from the people who love you is the fastest way to lose yourself." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You lost touch with him." "I tried to find him after graduation, but your family had moved. I hired investigators, searched public records, but your father wasn't exactly a digital footprint kind of man. I found his obituary 5 years too late." Her voice broke slightly. "I never got to say thank you. Never got to tell him what his belief in me became." The coffee shop around them seemed to fade into background noise as David processed this information. His father had helped launch an artist's career, had probably changed the trajectory of this woman's entire life, and had never said a word about it at home. It was so typical of Robert Matthews that David almost laughed. "What did it become?" he asked finally. Sophia reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a news article. The headline made David's hands shake. "Local art dealer, Sophia Smith donates $5 million to Children's Hospital." The photo showed a woman in an elegant black dress, surrounded by paintings that David's untrained eye could tell were worth more than most people made in a lifetime. "You're that Sophia Smith," he whispered. "I own 7 galleries across 3 states. I represent some of the most successful contemporary artists in the country. Last year, my personal collection was valued at over $200 million. She put the phone away and looked directly into his eyes. "And every bit of it started with a high school art teacher who saw something in an angry teenager that she couldn't see in herself." David's world tilted again, this time more violently. The modest woman across from him was wealthy beyond his comprehension, and she was sitting in a small coffee shop explaining how his father had changed her life. The same father he'd sometimes resented for caring too much about other people's kids. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "Because when I heard your name in that bank, when I saw you sitting there with medical bills and that brave face you're trying so hard to maintain, I saw your father. Same quiet dignity, same willingness to carry the weight of the world without complaint." Sophia leaned forward, her voice intense but gentle. "Your daughter needs surgery, and you can't afford it. I can fix that problem with a phone call." "I can't accept charity," David said automatically, the words programmed by a lifetime of Matthews' family pride. "It's not charity," Sophia replied. "It's a debt. Your father invested in my future when he had no reason to believe it would pay off. He gave me art supplies when your family needed that money for groceries. He wrote recommendation letters on his own time, drove me to portfolio reviews in his own car, never asked for anything in return. David felt tears burning behind his eyes and fought them back. He never told me any of this, because he was your father, not your friend. His job was to provide for you and your mother, not to burden you with his choices. But those choices saved my life, David. They literally created the person I became. Sophia's voice grew quiet but firm. Letting me help Emma isn't charity. It's allowing me to complete a circle that's been broken for 17 years. The logic was compelling, but David's pride fought against it like a caged animal. Taking money from a stranger felt wrong on every level his father had taught him to value. But letting Emma suffer because of his pride felt infinitely worse. What exactly are you proposing? He asked carefully. I'll cover Emma's medical expenses, all of them. Surgery, recovery, follow-up treatments, whatever she needs. In exchange, you let me establish an art education foundation in your father's name. Something that helps kids like I was, kids with talent but no resources. David stared at her for a long moment, seeing not a wealthy benefactor but a scared 16-year-old girl his father had believed in. He would have loved that. He said finally, I know he would. The question is, will you let me do it? Before David could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. Emma's school. His heart stopped as he read the words. Please come immediately. Emma collapsed during lunch. Ambulance en route to St. Mary's. The coffee cup slipped from David's numb fingers, shattering against the floor. Sophia was already standing, her purse in one hand and her phone in the other. Go, she said firmly. I'll meet you at the hospital. David ran for his car, his mind reeling with fear and possibility. Behind him, Sophia Smith was already on the phone with St. Mary's Hospital, explaining in calm, authoritative tones that whatever Emma Matthews needed would be taken care of immediately. Money was no object. Time was the only currency that mattered now. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed prayers. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and Robert's access card bounced against his chest with each turn. He thought about his father's quiet lessons, about accepting help when it was offered with genuine love, about pride being a luxury that parents couldn't always afford. By the time he reached St. Mary's, the decision had made itself. St. Mary's Hospital at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon was a study in controlled chaos. David burst through the emergency room doors, his heart hammering against his ribs as he approached the reception desk. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up with the practiced calm of someone who dealt with panicked parents daily. Emma Matthews, David said, his voice raw. My daughter. The school called and said, she's stable. The nurse interrupted gently, her words cutting through his panic like a lifeline. Room 207. Dr. Patel is with her now. David's legs nearly gave out with relief. Stable. The word echoed in his mind as he hurried toward the elevators, past walls lined with children's artwork that reminded him painfully of his father's classroom. The second floor smelled of antiseptic and hope, that particular hospital mixture that parents learned to navigate by necessity. He found Emma's room and paused outside the door, steadying himself. Through the small window, he could see his 8-year-old daughter propped up in bed, looking impossibly small against the white sheets. She was awake, talking to a doctor in a white coat, and David felt the last of his panic dissolve into manageable worry. Daddy! Emma called out as he entered, her voice weak but bright. I'm okay. I just got really tired during lunch, and Mrs. Patterson got scared. Dr. Patel, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, extended her hand to David. Mr. Matthews, I'm glad you're here. Emma's stable, but we need to talk about moving up her surgery timeline. The words hit David like a physical blow. They'd been hoping to buy more time, to find a way to afford the procedure without destroying their lives financially. But Emma's condition was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. "How much time do we have?" David asked, sinking into the chair beside Emma's bed. His daughter reached for his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "Days, not weeks," Dr. Patel said gently. "The good news is that we had a cancellation in our surgery schedule. We can do the procedure this Friday if we can resolve the insurance and payment issues." David's stomach dropped. Friday was 3 days away. The insurance company had already denied coverage for the experimental procedure, and his loan application was dead in the water. He was exactly where he'd been 4 hours ago, except now the timeline had compressed to an impossible deadline. "Mr. Matthews?" A familiar voice spoke from the doorway. Sophia Smith stood there, still in her grey coat, but somehow she looked different now. More authoritative, like someone accustomed to making things happen. "I came as soon as I could." Emma looked between her father and the stranger with curious eyes. "Daddy, who's the lady?" "This is Miss Smith," David said carefully. "She's a friend of Grandpa Robert's." Sophia approached the bed with the careful movements of someone who understood that children in hospitals required a different kind of presence. "Hello, Emma. Your grandfather was a very special man. He taught me to draw when I was about your age." "Grandpa taught me to draw too," Emma said, brightening slightly. "Before he went to heaven. Daddy's not very good at art, but he tries." Despite everything, David found himself smiling. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, kiddo." Dr. Patel looked between the adults, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "Mr. Matthews, I'll give you some time to discuss the payment arrangements. The surgery scheduler will need confirmation by tomorrow morning." After the doctor left, the room fell into a heavy silence. Emma had dozed off, exhausted by the day's events, leaving David and Sophia alone with the weight of an impossible decision. "The foundation we discussed," Sophia said quietly. "We could establish it immediately. Create a medical assistance fund as its first initiative. Emma would be our inaugural recipient." David stared at his sleeping daughter, at the brave little face that had endured so much already. Every instinct screamed against accepting help from a virtual stranger, no matter what her connection to his father might be. But watching Emma's labored breathing, seeing the faint blue tinge around her lips that meant her heart was working too hard, pride seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. "What would my father do?" he asked, more to himself than to Sophia. "He'd do whatever it took to save his granddaughter," she replied without hesitation. "Just like he did whatever it took to save an angry teenager who thought the world owed her nothing but heartache." David closed his eyes, remembering his father's voice during one of their last conversations. Robert had been weak from the cancer treatments, but his words had been clear. "Taking care of people isn't about deserving help, son. It's about love finding a way to flow where it's needed most." "Okay," David whispered, the word barely audible. "Okay." Sophia pulled out her phone and began making calls with the efficiency of someone who moved millions of dollars regularly. David listened in amazement as she spoke with hospital administrators, insurance companies, and what sounded like her personal attorney. Within an hour, Emma's surgery was not only scheduled, but fully funded through something called the Robert Matthews Medical Education Foundation. "Just like that?" David asked when she finished. "Money is a tool," Sophia replied. "Your father taught me that talent is a tool too, and love is the most powerful tool of all. Sometimes you have to use the tools you have to honor the tools someone else gave you." As evening fell, David found himself in the hospital cafeteria with Sophia, sharing terrible coffee and the kind of conversation that only happens between strangers who've suddenly become bound by circumstances beyond their control. She told him about her galleries, about the artists she'd discovered and nurtured, about the scholarship programs she'd quietly funded over the years. "I've been searching for your father for almost 2 decades," she admitted. "Not just to say thank you, but to understand something. He saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. How do you do that? How do you believe in someone's future when their present is such a mess?" David thought about his father, about the quiet way Robert had approached the world with hope, despite evidence that hope was often misplaced. Dad used to say that people aren't broken, just unfinished, like paintings that need the right light to reveal what was always there. He said something similar to me once. That talent was like a seed in winter ground, looks dead from the surface, but just waiting for the right conditions to bloom. Sophia smiled sadly. "I spent so many years trying to prove he was right to believe in me. Never occurred to me that his believing was proof enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people connected by a man who'd understood that investing in others was the only investment that truly mattered. Outside the cafeteria windows, the city lights began to twinkle like stars, and David felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope, that would come later, but something like the possibility of hope. "Tell me about the foundation," he said finally. What would it actually do? Sophia's eyes lit up with the passion of someone who'd found her purpose. Art education for underserved kids, medical assistance for families facing impossible choices, scholarship programs for students who have talent but no resources. Everything your father believed in, everything he was already doing but on a scale he never could have imagined. "And you want me to be involved? I want you to run it," she said simply. "You understand what your father was trying to accomplish better than anyone. You've lived the kinds of struggles the foundation would address. And—" she paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm good at making money and buying art. I'm terrible at understanding what people actually need." David laughed, a sound that surprised him with its genuine warmth. "I'm a construction worker who barely finished community college. What makes you think I could run a foundation?" "Because you're Robert Matthews's son," Sophia replied. "Because you've spent the last 6 months working 16-hour days to save your daughter's life. Because when I offered you help today, your first instinct was to refuse it, not because you don't need it, but because you don't want to take something you haven't earned." The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with a text from Emma's nurse. She was asking for both of them, apparently having remembered something important about her grandfather that she wanted to share. They returned to find Emma wide awake, more alert than she'd been in weeks. "Miss Smith," Emma said as they entered her room, "Daddy told me you knew Grandpa Robert. Did he really teach you to draw?" "He did," Sophia said, settling into the chair beside Emma's bed. "He was the best teacher I ever had. I have some of his drawings," Emma said, gesturing toward David's jacket. "Daddy always carries them. Show her, Daddy." David hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From behind his driver's license, he carefully extracted 3 small sketches, each no bigger than a playing card. They were studies his father had done of Emma as a baby, sleeping, laughing, reaching for something just out of frame. Robert had carried them everywhere, saying they reminded him that beauty was always worth looking for. Sophia took the sketches with trembling hands, and David watched her face transform as she studied them. The style was unmistakable, the same confident lines, the same ability to capture not just what someone looked like, but who they were. These weren't the work of a high school art teacher killing time. These were the drawings of a true artist who'd chosen to teach instead of pursuing his own career. "He was so much better than he let anyone know," Sophia whispered, tears openly flowing now. "These are museum-quality drawings, David. Your father could have been anything he wanted in the art world." "He was what he wanted," David replied quietly. "He was a teacher. He used to say that creating art was good, but creating artists was better." Emma watched the adults with the serious expression children develop when they sense they're witnessing something important. "Grandpa said that love makes everything more beautiful, even sad things." Both David and Sophia looked at her in surprise. Robert had indeed said those words many times, but neither had expected his 8-year-old granddaughter to remember them, let alone understand them. "He was right," Sophia said, carefully handing the sketches back to David. "These drawings are beautiful because they're full of love, and what we're doing now, helping you get better so you can grow up strong and healthy, that's beautiful too because it comes from the same place." Emma nodded sagely, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. "So, the foundation thing Daddy and you are talking about, that's like Grandpa's love getting bigger?" David felt his breath catch. Leave it to a child to cut through all the complexity and guilt and pride to reach the simple truth at the center of everything. The foundation wasn't about charity or debt or even gratitude. It was about love finding new ways to flow through the world. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's exactly what it is." As visiting hours ended and David prepared to leave Emma for the night, Sophia quietly handed him a business card with her personal number. "Call me tomorrow after you talk to the surgical team. We'll need to coordinate a few things before Friday." "Sophia," David said as she gathered her coat. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "Thank your father," she replied. "I'm just returning something he lent me 17 years ago." "What's that?" "Faith in tomorrow." David watched her walk down the hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Tomorrow his daughter would begin the process that would save her life. Tomorrow he would start learning how to run a foundation dedicated to his father's memory. Tomorrow the circle of kindness that Robert Matthews had started with a shy, angry teenager would begin expanding in ways none of them could fully imagine yet. But tonight, sitting beside Emma's hospital bed as she drifted off to sleep, David simply held his father's sketches and marveled at how love could travel through time, transforming everything it touched along the way. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often accompanies life-changing moments. David had barely slept, spending the night alternating between Emma's bedside and the hospital's family lounge, where Sophia had quietly arranged for a comfortable chair and blanket to be waiting for him. The small gesture spoke volumes about her attention to details that mattered, the kind of thoughtfulness that couldn't be bought with money alone. Dr. Patel arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, her confident presence filling the room like sunlight. Emma was already awake, having been too excited about surgery day to sleep much either. The combination of 8-year-old resilience and complete trust in the adults around her created an energy that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Ready to fix this ticker of yours?" Dr. Patel asked, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed with the casual familiarity that made her such a remarkable pediatric surgeon. "Will I be able to run really fast afterward?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. "Faster than your dad, probably," Dr. Patel replied with a grin. Though that might not be saying much. David made an exaggerated sound of protest, and Emma giggled, the first real laughter he'd heard from her in months. The sound was worth more than all of Sophia's galleries combined. Sophia arrived as the pre-surgical team began their preparations, carrying a small wrapped package that she placed on Emma's bedside table. "Something to keep you company while you're getting better," she said simply. Emma unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, clearly expensive, but not ostentatiously so. On the cover, embossed in simple gold letters, were the words, Emma's Art Adventures. Grandpa always said that the best art comes from the heart, Emma said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. Will you teach me to draw like he taught you? I would be honored, Sophia replied, and David heard 17 years of searched for redemption in those 4 words. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and paperwork. David signed forms that Sophia's lawyers had prepared, establishing the Robert Matthews Foundation and designating Emma as its first medical assistance recipient. The documentation was complex, but the essence was simple. His father's belief in the power of helping others was about to become something larger than any of them had imagined. As they wheeled Emma towards the surgical suite, she called out to David and Sophia, "Take care of each other while I'm sleeping, okay? Grandpa would want you to be friends." The words hung in the air long after the elevator doors closed. David and Sophia found themselves alone in the surgical waiting area, surrounded by the anxious energy of other families facing their own impossible moments. The morning stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of potential outcomes they couldn't control. "She has your father's wisdom," Sophia observed, settling into a chair that faced the windows overlooking the city. "That ability to see what people need, even when they don't see it themselves." "Emma's always been like that," David replied, his voice tight with worry. Too wise for her age, too willing to take care of everyone else's feelings. He paused, staring at his hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I failed her by not giving her a normal childhood." "You gave her something better than normal," Sophia said firmly. "You gave her purpose. She knows she's loved, knows she matters, knows that love means showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city wake up below them. David found himself thinking about the previous evening's conversation with Emma when she'd asked him to explain exactly what the foundation would do. Her questions had been surprisingly sophisticated, cutting straight to the heart of issues he'd never fully considered. "Will we help kids whose daddies died too?" she'd asked, and David had realized that his daughter understood loss in ways most 8-year-olds never had to. Her grandfather's death, her mother's abandonment, her own illness. Emma had been forced to confront mortality and uncertainty with a maturity that both impressed and worried him. "We'll help anyone who needs it," he'd promised, and she'd nodded with satisfaction, as if this answer confirmed something important about the way the world should work. Now, sitting in the surgical waiting area, David began to understand what Emma had grasped instinctively. The foundation wasn't just about continuing his father's work. It was about creating a place where children like Emma could see that their struggles had meaning, that their experiences could become sources of strength for others facing similar challenges. "I want Emma to be involved," he said suddenly, "not just as a recipient, but as part of the decision-making process when she's older. She understands things about need and help that most adults never learn." Sophia smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her since their coffee shop conversation. "Your father would love that. He always believed that the people who'd been through something were the best qualified to help others through it." "Is that why you became successful?" David asked. "To prove something to yourself? Or to him?" "Both, neither. I don't know anymore," Sophia replied honestly. "Success was supposed to be my way of saying thank you, but I think I got lost somewhere along the way. Started believing that having money meant I understood what people needed." She gestured around the waiting room, at the families clutching coffee cups and prayer cards. "This is the first time in years that I've used my resources for something that actually matters." Dr. Patel appeared in the waiting room doorway at 3:15 p.m., still wearing her surgical scrubs, but with a smile that told them everything they needed to know before she said a word. "Perfect success," she announced. "Emma's heart is going to work beautifully now. She'll be groggy for a few hours, but you can see her in recovery." David felt his knees give out slightly, and Sophia steadied him with a hand on his arm. The relief was so overwhelming that he couldn't speak for several minutes, just nodded and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Emma looked impossibly small in the recovery room, surrounded by monitors and IV lines. But her color was already better than David had seen in months. The blue tinge around her lips was gone, replaced by a healthy pink that made her look like a child again instead of a patient. "She'll sleep for most of the evening," the recovery nurse explained. "But her vitals are excellent. Dr. Patel expects a full recovery." David pulled a chair close to Emma's bedside and took her small hand in his. For the first time in 6 months, he allowed himself to believe that his daughter was going to live a normal life, that she would grow up and create art and maybe even help other children facing the same fears they'd just conquered. Sophia quietly took out her phone and began making calls, arranging for the recovery room to be stocked with anything David might need for a long night of bedside vigil. Blankets, decent coffee, a selection of sandwiches from the hospital's surprisingly good cafe. She worked with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems through resources and determination, but there was something different about her approach now. Less commanding, more collaborative, more human. As evening settled over the hospital, Emma began to stir. Her first words were predictably practical. "Did it work? Can I run now?" "Let's start with walking," David said, laughing through tears he hadn't realized he was crying. "But yes, kiddo, it worked." Emma's gaze found Sophia, who was sitting quietly in the corner, trying not to intrude on the family moment. "Miss Smith, are you crying too?" "Happy tears," Sophia replied, not bothering to wipe them away. "The best kind." "Grandpa used to cry happy tears when I showed him my drawings," Emma said drowsily. "He said that beauty was supposed to make people feel things, even if they didn't understand why." Over the next 3 days, as Emma's recovery progressed with remarkable speed, David and Sophia found themselves building something that neither had expected, a genuine partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. They spent hours discussing the Foundation's mission, walking the hospital corridors while Emma napped, sketching out programs that would address not just financial need, but the deeper isolation that came with facing impossible circumstances alone. "Your father didn't just give me art supplies," Sophia explained during one of these conversations. "He gave me a place to belong. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, I had somewhere to go where someone believed I was worth investing in. That belonging was more valuable than any scholarship." David understood completely. His own childhood had been anchored by his father's quiet presence, the sense that Robert Matthews would always be there to help him figure out whatever came next. It wasn't until after his father's death that David realized how rare that kind of unconditional support actually was. They decided that the foundation would focus on 3 core areas: medical assistance for families facing catastrophic expenses, art education programs for underserved children, and mentorship initiatives that paired young people with adults who could provide guidance and encouragement. Each program would be infused with Robert Matthews's fundamental belief that investing in people was the highest form of art. "We'll need a space," Sophia said as they finalized their plans. "Somewhere central, accessible, welcoming. Not just offices, but galleries and classrooms and meeting rooms where people can gather." "Dad's old school is being renovated," David offered. "Jefferson High is getting a complete rebuild, but they're looking for community partners to share some of the new facilities, the art wing especially. They need someone to help fund and program it." Sophia's eyes lit up with possibility. "Full circle," she murmured. "Robert Matthews Art Center at Jefferson High School, a place where his work can continue, where new generations of students can discover what they're capable of becoming." Emma was discharged on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 week after her surgery, skipping out of the hospital with an energy David hadn't seen since before her diagnosis. Dr. Patel's parting words were music to his ears. Regular checkups, normal activities, and no restrictions on dreaming big. The drive home took them past Jefferson High School, where construction crews were already working on the renovation. Emma pressed her face to the car window, studying the building where her grandfather had spent 30 years nurturing young artists. "Will there be a picture of Grandpa in the art center?" she asked. "The biggest, most beautiful portrait we can commission," Sophia promised from the passenger seat. "And a gallery dedicated to student work, just like he would have wanted. And a scholarship program for kids who can't afford art supplies?" "Already being set up," David confirmed. "The first recipients will be announced next month." Emma nodded with satisfaction, as if checking items off an invisible list. "Good. Grandpa would be proud of us." The simple statement carried more weight than any formal dedication ceremony could have managed. They were honoring Robert Matthews not just with money or buildings, but by continuing the work he'd started, by believing in people the way he had always believed in them. 6 months later, David stood in the completed Robert Matthews Art Center, watching Sophia work with a group of high school students on a mural that would cover the center's main wall. The students came from backgrounds similar to Sophia's teenage years, kids who'd been written off by other adults, who'd never been told that their creative dreams were worth pursuing. "Art isn't about having the perfect supplies or the most expensive training," Sophia was telling them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned this lesson the hard way. "Art is about seeing the world clearly and having the courage to show others what you see." Emma, now 9 and fully recovered, sat in the front row with her own sketchbook, capturing the scene with the focused intensity she'd inherited from her grandfather. Her drawings had improved dramatically over the past months, guided by both Sophia's technical instruction and David's encouragement to find her own voice. The foundation had grown beyond anything David had imagined possible. They'd helped 47 families with medical expenses, established art programs in 12 schools, and created a mentorship network that connected young artists with professional guidance and emotional support. Each success story felt like a note in the symphony Robert Matthews had begun decades earlier. "Mr. Matthews?" One of the mural students approached him during a break. "Miss Smith told us about your dad, about how he helped her when she was our age. I just wanted to say thanks for keeping his work going." The boy couldn't have been more than 16, with paint-stained fingers and the guarded expression of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from adults. David saw his father in that moment, saw Robert's patient determination to look past the defensive postures and find the potential that others missed. "My dad would say that his work was never really his," David replied. "It belonged to everyone he taught, everyone they taught in turn. We're just making sure it doesn't stop." As the afternoon session ended and the students packed up their supplies, Sophia joined David and Emma near the large windows overlooking the school's courtyard. Construction workers were installing a bronze plaque near the building's main entrance, formally dedicating the Robert Matthews Art Center. "I have something for you," Sophia said, pulling a wrapped package from her bag. "Both of you, actually." Emma unwrapped it eagerly to reveal a framed drawing, one of the sketches Robert had done of her as a baby, but now professionally matted and displayed. Below it was a small brass nameplate that read, "Emma Matthews, age 3 months. Love makes everything more beautiful. This belongs in your home," Sophia said. "But I wanted you to see how beautiful it looks when it's treated like the masterpiece it is." David felt tears gathering again, the happy kind that Emma had learned to recognize and celebrate. His father's simple sketch, carried in a wallet for years, had been transformed into something worthy of any gallery wall. More than that, it had been given the respect Robert himself had never sought for his own work. "There's something else," Sophia continued, her voice taking on a formal tone that David had learned meant she was about to surprise them. The board of directors for the Robert Matthews Foundation needs to vote on expanding our mission. We've been approached by school districts in 3 other states, asking us to bring our programs to their communities. Emma looked up from her drawing with bright eyes. Does that mean more kids will get to learn art? Hundreds more, Sophia confirmed. But it also means a lot more work, a lot more traveling, a lot more responsibility for your dad. David looked around the art center, at the students cleaning brushes and discussing their projects with the enthusiasm of people who'd discovered they had something valuable to offer the world. 6 months ago, he'd been a construction worker desperate to save his daughter's life. Now he was the director of a foundation that was changing lives across multiple states. What would Dad do? He asked, echoing the question that had guided every major decision over the past year. He'd say yes, Emma answered before anyone else could speak. Because more kids deserve to know they're special. Out of the mouths of babes, David thought, remembering his father's frequent amazement at the wisdom children possessed when adults bothered to listen to them. Then yes, he said to Sophia. Let's see how big this thing can grow. As they prepared to leave the art center, David took one last look around the space that had become the physical embodiment of his father's legacy. Students' artwork covered the walls, scholarship announcements filled a bulletin board near the entrance, and the faint scent of paint and possibility hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Outside, the bronze plaque caught the late afternoon sunlight, casting shadows that made the engraved words seem to dance. Robert Matthews Art Center, dedicated to the belief that every person has something beautiful to offer the world. Emma skipped ahead toward the car, clutching her framed drawing and chattering about the mural techniques she'd learned. Sophia walked beside David in comfortable silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what they'd built together. Do you think he knows? Sophia asked as they reached the parking lot. Somehow, do you think your father knows what grew from those art lessons he gave me? David considered the question seriously, watching his daughter dance around the car with the boundless energy of a completely healthy child. Dad used to say that love never really dies. It just finds new ways to express itself. Looking at Emma, looking at what we've created together, looking at all those kids in there discovering they have gifts worth sharing. He paused, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. Yeah, I think he knows, and I think he's proud of all of us. The drive home took them through the heart of their small city, past the community bank where this entire journey had begun. David glanced at the building as they passed, remembering the desperate man who'd sat in that vinyl chair just 7 months ago, clutching medical bills and facing impossible choices. That man had been so focused on what he couldn't provide for his daughter that he'd nearly missed the most important lesson his father had tried to teach him. That accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a recognition of the interconnectedness that makes meaningful life possible. Daddy, Emma said from the back seat, breaking into his thoughts. When I grow up, I want to help run the foundation. Is that okay? More than okay, David replied, catching her eyes in the rearview mirror. But you don't have to decide that now. You have lots of time to figure out what you want to be. I already know, Emma said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children can muster. I want to be like Grandpa Robert. I want to help people see how beautiful they are. And there it was. David realized. The true measure of his father's success. The ultimate validation of every choice Robert Matthews had made during his 30 years of teaching. Not the galleries or foundations or bronze plaques, but the simple desire of a 9-year-old girl to continue the work of helping people recognize their own worth. As they pulled into their driveway, David felt a profound sense of completion, as if the circle that had begun with his father's kindness to a struggling teenager had finally found its way home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the foundation's reach, new chances to honor Robert's memory through action rather than words. But tonight, as Emma hung her grandfather's drawing in the place of honor above their fireplace, and Sophia joined them for a simple dinner of homemade soup and store-bought bread, David Matthews understood that he was living inside his father's greatest masterpiece, a life dedicated to the radical proposition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and given the chance to flourish. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community Bank seemed less harsh now when David visited to make the foundation's quarterly deposits. The loan officer who'd rejected his application 7 months earlier always greeted him with genuine warmth. Having watched the local news coverage of the art center's opening and the foundation's expanding work. Hard to believe it all started in this lobby, she'd remarked during his last visit, gesturing toward the spot where he'd first encountered Sophia Smith. Best rejection I ever received, David had replied, and meant it completely. Because sometimes the word no is just the universe's way of pointing you toward a much bigger yes, one that includes not just your own dreams, but the dreams of everyone whose life you're meant to touch along the way. The children had adapted to their parents' partnership with the resilience that made adults envious and hopeful in equal measure. Grace and Noah had become genuine friends, bonding over their shared experience of having parents who built things and their mutual pride in being part of a story that had ended well despite its difficult beginning. They'd helped design elements of the playground at the new Oakland schools, insisting on features that would be both fun and safe, and their input had reminded the adults that the ultimate purpose of construction was to create spaces where life could flourish. On the anniversary of the Riverside earthquake, Ethan and Alexandra had stood together at the site where the old school had once stood, now marked by a memorial garden honoring the resilience of the community that had survived the disaster. The inscription on the central monument read simply, "In memory of lessons learned and lives protected." And both of them understood that their own relationship had become part of that larger story of growth through adversity. Grace and Noah had placed flowers at the memorial, their easy friendship serving as proof that even the most complicated adult conflicts could be resolved when people chose love over pride. The question Grace had asked in the hospital waiting room, "Did you know this was going to happen?" had evolved from an innocent inquiry into something deeper and more challenging. Ethan had finally answered her honestly, explaining that he'd been worried about the building's safety, but hadn't been able to convince the grown-ups to listen to his concerns. Grace had processed this information with the directness that children brought to complex moral questions, concluding that sometimes adults made mistakes, but that what mattered most was learning to do better next time. Her simple wisdom had become a guiding principle for the new company, where every decision was evaluated not just for its immediate benefits, but for its long-term consequences on the people who would live and work in the buildings they created. As Ethan watched the sun set over San Francisco Bay from the office he now shared with Alexandra, he reflected on the journey that had brought them from adversaries to partners, from a professional disagreement that had cost him his career to a collaboration that had given both of them a deeper sense of purpose. The city's skyline was dotted with buildings he'd helped design over the years, each one representing someone's vision of a better future made manifest in steel and concrete. But the structure he was most proud of wasn't visible from his office window. It was the trust he and Alexandra had rebuilt between them, the friendship their children had forged despite their parents' complicated history, and the commitment they'd made to ensure that integrity would never again be treated as a luxury in their professional lives. The phone on his desk buzzed with a text message from Noah, asking if Grace could come over for dinner and help with a science project about earthquake-resistant building design. Ethan smiled as he typed back his agreement, then looked across the office at Alexandra, who was reviewing plans for their latest project with the kind of intense focus that had once intimidated him. Now he recognized it as the expression of someone who understood that getting the details right could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe, between protecting families and destroying them. She looked up and caught him watching her, and her smile carried the warmth of someone who'd learned that being right wasn't nearly as important as being trusted. "Some people think integrity is a luxury," he'd said on that terrible day when everything changed. But time had proven that integrity was actually the foundation upon which everything worthwhile was built, and sometimes the most expensive choices turned out to be the ones that created the most value in the end. Grace and Noah's laughter drifted up from the street below, where they were playing in the small park that had been built to replace the demolished elementary school, and Ethan knew that every difficult decision he'd made had been worth it to hear that sound of children who felt safe enough to play without fear. In the growing dusk of a Millbrook evening, walking toward a future that held promise instead of just survival, Tom understood that some stories don't end with loss, but begin with it, using grief as a foundation for joy that runs deeper because it acknowledges the cost of loving fully. Grace's laughter echoed off the cemetery walls like music, and Maggie's hand in his felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. Anna's gift to them hadn't been a replacement for what they'd lost, but an expansion of what they'd thought possible. Love that multiplied instead of diminished, hope that grew stronger because it had been tested by the worst life could offer. The paint box sat safely in Grace's backpack, no longer a relic of the past, but a tool for creating futures Anna could only have dreamed of, colors mixed with intention and applied with the confidence that comes from understanding that beauty is not diminished by sadness but made more precious because of it. The last visitors departed as darkness settled over the city, leaving the gallery space peaceful and warm in the glow of carefully positioned lighting that accommodated various sensory processing needs. Ruby had fallen asleep curled up next to her latest color study, while Jasper continued working on mathematical calculations for their next collaborative project. Zoe was reading quietly in a corner, occasionally looking up to observe the comfortable domesticity of their unconventional family gathering. Helena began the gentle process of transitioning the children toward home and bedtime routines, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to create structure without rigidity, accommodation without chaos. Benjamin gathered art supplies and turned off equipment, his hands moving through familiar patterns that had become meditative rather than merely functional. As they prepared to leave the gallery space that had become the visible symbol of their commitment to honoring neurodivergent gifts, Benjamin paused to look once more at the children's collaborative installation. The piece seemed to pulse with its own internal light, geometric patterns and flowing colors, creating a visual representation of minds working together in harmony rather than competition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: funding applications and research collaborations, therapeutic sessions with children whose gifts hadn't yet been recognized, conversations with educators and parents who were beginning to understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of healing and creativity and love that had emerged from their willingness to risk authentic connection, Benjamin Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to stop hiding from his own gifts and the people who needed them most. The drive home through the quiet city streets was filled with the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to communicate through presence as much as words, their different ways of processing and expressing emotion woven together into something resilient and beautiful and entirely their own. And in the peaceful breathing of children who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply, Benjamin could hear the echo of Luna's voice, reminding him that the most important art was always the kind that helped other people remember they weren't alone in the world.